Good morning. Today's public hearing is about to begin. This hearing is being conducted remotely via Zoom, and the live stream will be available on the TLC's website. All persons wishing to testify were asked to sign up in advance of the hearing. All registered speakers are joining the meeting via Zoom. If you are speaking today, your audio and video were automatically muted. When your name is called, the moderator will activate your account and you will have control of your camera and microphone. When ready, please state your name and affiliation and then proceed with your testimony. Public testimony will be limited to 2 minutes per speaker. When your testimony is complete, your audio and video will be muted by the moderator. Any additional comments may be submitted in writing to the Commission for consideration by 5 p.m. today. A special note for our registered speakers: please ensure that your display name in the Zoom meeting matches the name that you used when you signed up to speak. This will enable the moderator to confirm that you are present in the meeting. Closed captioning is available for today's meeting. Consecutive interpretation is also available. During the sign-up process, individuals were asked if they require language assistance. A Spanish interpreter has been made available. If you are using an interpreter, when your name is called, please speak and the interpreter will repeat your testimony in English. Thank you for your attention. Please hold until we are ready to begin. We will repeat this message in Spanish. Spanish interpreter, please go ahead.
Buen día. La audiencia pública de hoy está por comenzar. Esta audiencia está siendo llevada a cabo por Zoom, por live stream. Esta será disponible en TLC, en el sitio web de TLC. Todas las personas que deseen testificar van a ser pedidas que se ingresen por adelantado a la audiencia. Todos los hablantes, todos los oradores registrados están uniéndose a la reunión por Zoom. Si ustedes están hablando hoy, su audio y video serán automáticamente silenciados. Cuando su nombre sea llamado, el moderador activará su cuenta y ustedes tendrán control de su cámara y micrófono. Cuando estén listos, por favor, digan su nombre y a qué están afiliados. Y luego procederán con su testimonio. El testimonio público será limitado a 2 minutos por orador. Cuando un testimonio se complete, su audio y video serán silenciados por el moderador. Cualquier comentario adicional puede ser enviado por escrito a la comisión para consideración a las 5 de la tarde de hoy. Una nota especial para nuestros oradores registrados. Por favor, asegúrense que pongan su nombre en la reunión de Zoom que corresponda con el nombre que ustedes utilizaron cuando ustedes ingresaron para hablar. Esto habilitará al moderador a confirmar que ustedes están presentes en la reunión. El subtitulado cerrado está disponible durante toda la reunión de hoy y la interpretación consecutiva también está disponible. Durante el proceso de ingreso de los individuos pueden ser pedidos si ellos requieren asistencia con el idioma. Un intérprete de español ha sido puesto disponible si ustedes están utilizando un intérprete. Cuando su nombre sea convocado, por favor, hablen y el intérprete repetirá su testimonio en inglés. Gracias por su atención. Por favor, aguarden hasta que nosotros estemos listos para iniciar y recuerden los oradores de español hablar en frases cortas para que el intérprete pueda interpretar. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Spanish interpreter. I will now yield the floor to our Commissioner and Chair, David Doe.
Well, good morning. The time is now 10:06, and welcome to today's public hearing on TLC's proposed rules on high-volume for-hire service minimum driver pay. I am Commissioner David Doe, and I'm joined by Commissioner Sorrentino, Velasquez, Chen, Bader, Kaufman, and Mitchell. We're here today to have a robust public discussion about our proposed amendments to our minimum pay rules for high-volume for-hire services. Our licensees have been waiting a long time for this, and I'd like to thank them all for their patience and perseverance. The access restrictions Uber and Lyft imposed on licensees last year were harmful, unnecessary, and unacceptable. We saw the companies locking out drivers in the middle of their shifts with no idea when they would be allowed to work again. We saw reports of drivers being told to drive to busier areas, even areas when surge pricing was happening, only to still be denied access. We saw drivers and their families suffering, unsure of when they would be able to work again, uncertain if they would be able to pay their bills. In New York City, where most drivers don't need to own a car, 70% of our high volume drivers work full time, and they're the best drivers in the country. For most, it's their regular job. Imagine being told to come to work, then only being told that you can't work, but we won't even pay you for showing up. The app companies blame the lockouts on TLC regulations. But let me be clear, nothing in our rules requires the app companies to restrict access for our drivers. This was their choice, as it was their choice to flood the market with more drivers than they ultimately were willing to pay. Our minimum pay rules were designed to disincentivize excessive onboarding, but unfortunately, that didn't work. They found a loophole, and drivers suffered. A big part of why we're here today is to tighten up that loophole and improve our protections for drivers. We want to make it clear for them to lock you out and take away more incentives for them to do it. And if in the future they insist on putting hardworking drivers through this again, at the very least, we want them to give you notice and we want them to let you work your full shift. But we certainly don't think it needs to come to that. I'd also like to thank my team here at the TLC, Dr. James Parrott, and the city's law department. And last but not least, the driver advocates for all of their hard work on driver pay in recent months. We have had a lot of good ideas and we want the same thing. No more lockouts. They are bad for drivers, they're bad for their families, bad for the industry, and bad for New York City. One of the people here at TLC who has probably spent more time than most studying our options when it comes to limiting and hopefully eliminating lockouts and ensuring driver pay keeps up with expenses is our Director of Policy Research, Russell Glynn. I'll now hand it over to Russell to walk everyone through their presentation on our proposal. Russell?
Thanks, Commissioner. I'm just going to pull up the presentation here. Can everyone see that? Yes. Great. So good morning, everyone. I'm Russell Glynn. I'm Director of Policy Research here at TLC, and I'm going to provide a brief overview of the proposed amendments to TLC's driver pay rules for high volume drivers. So I'll start by providing a summary on the history of the rules and their structure. Then I'll discuss the upcoming 2025 inflation increase and its relationship to changes in the per mile component of the pay formula before shifting gears and talking about some of the more substantive changes the rules propose to utilization rates and new measures to govern driver lockouts. So TLC's rules governing minimum pay for high volume drivers were implemented in 2019 and followed City Council legislation and a TLC commissioned independent study of earnings in the high volume sector. That study found that 85% of high volume drivers were making less than the minimum wage. So this was, of course, a critical concern to TLC. Based on this study, TLC developed a model that established a minimum per trip payment for drivers dispatched by high volume companies, which currently include Lyft and Uber. And this minimum payment is based on trip time and trip distance, and then scaled so that compensation from a single trip can account for a driver's total working time. And the way we scale that is using the utilization rate. And so those per trip payments are scaled, again, based on the proportion of time drivers spend actively on trip. So that structure has been in place since 2019. TLC has increased the minimum pay rates 5 times since 2019 to account for increased costs based on provisions in the rules that allow for annual inflation adjustments. So as I said, there are provisions in the rules to ensure that driver pay in the high volume sector tracks inflation. Something I want everyone to keep in mind is that separate from today's rule proposal, but related to some of the figures I'll talk about in a second, under existing rules, TLC analyzes inflation and adjusts the minimum pay standard every March to account for regional inflation as measured by the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index in the New York metro area. And so TLC will be implementing an inflation increase in March of this year of 3.92%. And again, that's based on last year's inflation figures. So something, again, to keep in mind with the figures related to pay that we'll talk about moving forward. So yes, as I said, we have these annual inflation adjustments, but now I'm going to talk about some of the problems related to driver pay TLC hopes to address through the proposed amendments. One problem relates to expenses. So amid changes to driver costs over the last 5 years, while we have, again, implemented those general inflation adjustments, TLC has not systematically reevaluated the underlying expense model. And what that means is the underlying composition of driver expenses, not just the amounts, but also the share that one expense contributes to the cost drivers pay versus others. And we wanted to see if our inflation adjustments were accurately reflecting shifts in driver expenses generally, especially given our suspicion, with all the changes in the industry over the last 5 years, such as the increase in electric vehicles and accessible vehicles. We wanted to see whether those inflation adjustments are in line with driver expenses today. And so to do that, TLC commissioned an independent study of driver expenses to get a more detailed accounting of current costs faced by drivers. That study combined a robust driver survey with an analysis of TLC and other public data. And it was important that the study include a survey so that drivers could provide input directly. And this helps us get very granular data on the costs faced by drivers of for-hire vehicles in New York City. It's difficult to find public data that is capturing costs for such a specific group. So we relied on the survey. The study relies on a survey, but it also validates those results using public data, such as advertised insurance premiums or data on gas prices where possible. And so through that analysis, the study arrived at a new per mile non-wave rate of just over 87 cents per mile, which reflects an increase of about 10% compared to the current rate. So in addition to driver expenses, some of the other substantial problems with the pay formula that these amendments seek to address relate to utilization rates. So under the current rules, TLC assesses utilization, again, the share of time drivers are actively on trip, assesses that rate and adjusts it annually. And based on that assessment, so long as the annual average rate for the entire industry, the entire high volume industry, is at least 53%, the industry is credited with a 58% utilization rate, meaning that they can use 58% in the pay formula when determining what is required minimum payment per trip. This approach with that 53% minimum and 58% applied rate was intended to provide flexibility to the companies so that we could avoid lockouts and give them again flexibility over the course of the year as utilization rate may vary. The problem now, due to the company's failure to keep drivers busy, is that 58% applied rate no longer reflects actual driver utilization. And so the companies have chosen to impose lockouts using this flexibility and taken advantage of it to pay drivers less. So the amendments we're talking about today set new utilization rates based on time, as we typically have, and a new distance-based utilization rate to account for both recent trends in utilization generally, so seeing that drivers are less busy than the 58% that we have typically applied, but also accounting for new data that allows TLC to estimate distance traveled by high volume for-hire vehicles. And so with this change, with the incorporation of a distance-based utilization rate, we can scale trip miles to capture all miles driven in a way that we similarly scale driver time. So based on an analysis of trip data and on the driving patterns of TLC drivers on high volume trips from between May 2023 to April 2024. That was the period we sampled to arrive at these new UR numbers. We are proposing a 53.5% utilization rate for time and a 68.5% utilization rate for distance. And I'll just say that the reason the analysis focused on the year from May 2023 to April 2024 is that this reflects trip demand and driver behavior pre-lockouts. And so before the companies began manipulating the utilization data using lockouts. So in addition to these changes to utilization and the incorporation of a distance-based utilization rate, we're also proposing that utilization rates no longer be recalculated on an annual basis, but instead be monitored and adjusted as needed.
Can I ask a question now? Make it clarified?
Sure.
Right now, according to this slide, they get credit for 58, but they're only having to hit 53.
That's right.
That one utilization rate for both time and distance?
Yeah, so under the current rules, there is one utilization for time and distance, and right now that applied utilization rate is 58%, so long as the annual industry-wide average is at least 53.
And but we're changing it, we're only changing one part because the 53.3 proposed is not really any different.
We are changing so that we are removing the 58% applied and instead will apply the 53.3% time-based utilization, which is based on that analysis of data from May 2023 to April 2024.
So we're not changing the time utilization rate, we're only changing the distance.
We are changing the
Yeah, but just to clarify, that 53.3% is the actual utilization between the period of May 2023 and April 2024.
Right.
It's unrelated to the current utilization at 53%.
Okay, but that's what I'm trying to wrap my head around.
Yep. So this is
I have a follow-up question. Are there particular reasons that we don't want to raise the 53.3% time-based utilization rate?
Right.
So we arrived at that figure through an analysis of data from before lockouts. So that is our best measure of actual time-based utilization. And, I'll remind everyone.
But one would assume that if we increase, or if the company are able to increase the time-based utilization, then driver pay would increase correspondingly, right?
So actually, driver pay, the minimum payment per trip goes down as the utilization rate increases. If you'll recall, it's trip miles plus trip time divided by the rate, which is a fraction. So that makes the number bigger. And so we're actually, by using 53.3, the actual utilization rate, instead of that applied 58%, that will increase driver pay to reflect actual utilization.
So in other words, the 53.3 UR is in the denominator of the formula.
Right.
Okay, well, if that's the case, by raising utilization rate, we're decreasing driver pay, why we want to increase the distance-based utilization rate?
So let me take a step back. We're right now 53%. The structure is that companies are credited with a 58% applied utilization rate. That 58% assumes drivers are busy 58% of the time. That's in the denominator. If we shift to the 53.3%, which reflects data analysis of how busy drivers actually are, that increases the minimum per trip payment.
Okay.
The distance-based utilization rate is new. We have not included a distance-based utilization rate previously. We have used the time-based utilization rate to scale the entire formula.
Mm-hmm.
But we are now proposing that the per minute aspect of the formula be scaled based on time, and the per mile aspect be scaled based on distance. So it is consistent between the two.
But there's a big difference in percentage, right?
That's right. That's right.
So I think what Ken is trying to figure out, and I am too, is if we lower the utilization, if we raise the utilization rate, according to your information, we decrease driver pay. If that's the case, why do we want to raise the utilization rate for distance if that's going to result in lower driver pay?
So this is common and best practices across other jurisdictions. This was not the genesis of the original pay standard in 2018. And so we're making sure that this goes with what is recommended across all academics, what is recommended by, or excuse me, what best practices in other jurisdictions have done. And they have been going towards a distance-based UR. And why that makes a lot of sense, right? Imagine if we use a distance formula for a time with a time-based utilization. It's comparing apples and oranges. While we've done it for 6 years, it doesn't mean that we should continue doing that into the future. Russell, do you have more to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just one thing I'll add is if you consider, I mean, you're right, Commissioner Bader, that 68.5% is new and it is higher than the time-based utilization. But that reflects, what you can imagine the typical driver's behavior looks like. They are more likely to maybe park and wait for a trip and then, make their way to pick a passenger up. And so as a share of all miles they travel while working, you might expect that the trip miles is a higher proportion of those miles because they're incentivized to do less driving while they're waiting to get a trip.
What I'm trying to get a handle on, first of all, any place like New York where there's a lot of traffic, the time is in a way a more important criteria than the distance. So and that goes across the board. So what I'm trying to get a handle on is why we would want to create a higher utilization rate based on distance if that's going to result in lower driver pay.
We will continue to scale the time-based component of the formula based on that 53.3%. But to what Commissioner Doe had said, this is allowing us to have consistency in the way we use utilization rates across both time and distance, and is possible because of new analysis that we're able to do on drivers' actual travel behavior.
I still don't get it.
Some of this data wasn't available previously, right? To make it more litigation proof, other proofing, we needed to put this component in. But overall, driver pay is going to increase on this proposal overall by 5.85% with the new driver expense study as well. And so overall, it increases.
Yeah. I don't want to hold it up anymore. It still doesn't make sense to me at all. Why we're going to have one that's 15% higher than the other when you're telling us that raising a utilization rate results in lower driver pay when what we want to do is when yet our goal here is to do the opposite.
Well, but it's also to make sure that all of our analysis is based in data-driven, data and analysis into the future. We can't just say, hey, we want, let's say, a 48% utilization for time and a 53% distance UR. I can't say that. I have to ensure that any number, be it 53.3% or 68.5%, is based in the data that we receive, right? So this is all. This is not 53.3% or 68.5% is not made up. It took a whole entire data engineering team, a data analysis team, Russell's team, to really, for many months, right, come to a very creative and innovative solution to get to both of these numbers. Russell, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I'm happy to continue discussing this, and maybe as I provide some more context for what this means for driver pay overall with this proposal, that will, assuage some of your concerns about reducing pay.
Okay, thank you.
So these are the aspects of the amendments that deal with utilization rates, and maybe, let's see, moving forward. So yes, to my point just now, what does all of this mean for the minimum trip payment for high volume drivers? And so if we think about our sample trip of 7.5 miles and 30 minutes, under the current minimum pay for that sample trip, the required payment is $27.69, and the proposed minimum with these amendments, the change to utilization rate, and the incorporation of findings from the driver expense study, as well as the inflation adjustment I mentioned earlier, that would bring the minimum pay for that sample trip to $29.31, which reflects an increase of 5.85%. So that's inclusive of inflation, our study of driver expenses, as well as the shift in how we use utilization rates in the pay formula. So finally, while the proposed changes to the utilization rate will significantly reduce the incentives for companies to restrict access to their platforms, TLC has included additional measures in the amendments to protect our drivers from lockouts. So the proposal includes two new requirements related to lockouts. One requirement, the notice requirement, requires that companies notify drivers of any access restrictions at least 72 hours before they take effect. The other requirement prohibits mid-shift lockouts by guaranteeing driver access for 16 hours upon logging on. And this comes, of course, with exceptions for compliance with other TLC rules related to driving time, such as our driver fatigue rules. So these two provisions related to lockouts address the unpredictability that access restrictions impose on drivers' lives and prevent the companies from manipulating the utilization data through lockouts, as we've seen in recent months. So with that, I look forward to hearing from the public, and I'm happy to address any additional questions from the Commission.
Russell, so there was a lot of misinformation in the last week from the high volume companies. And I'm going to ask a very straightforward question here. But one of the concerns was that the new rules would force cars 5 years and older offline. There is nothing in the rules that says that. Is that correct?
There is nothing in the rules that says that, no.
Thank you. Any other questions from commissioners?
I have a couple of questions. Thank you, Russell. That was really interesting, really helpful. My first question is, do any of these utilization rates cover deadheading, heading towards a ride for pickup?
Yes, both of the rates are used to capture P1 time, which is time waiting for dispatch, P2 time, time traveling to a passenger, and then active trip time.
Okay, so that increases pay on both sides of that. My second question is, do you anticipate any impact to rides that drivers accept or that apps push to drivers based on trip distance or length any differently than has been happening previously?
That's a good question, whether the utilization rate for distance might shift how the companies distribute rides. Right now, I wouldn't say I anticipate any changes, but we can certainly explore that further as we refine the methodology around the distance utilization rate, which I will say is something we've been working on internally and collaboratively with all stakeholders in the industry. And if it's new to us, we're certainly open to feedback on how we can best capture distance-based utilization.
Thank you.
Commissioners?
Yes, one more question here. Relative to the lockouts, is there someplace in the rule that will give us the ability to, I'm worried about the enforcement of the lockout and how we can make sure that that the lockout, like last time there was an agreement we had with them, and then they just, after a short time, they didn't pay attention to the agreement, and they went back to the way they were doing it before. Maybe they changed a little bit the way they were doing it before. What's locked into this to give us some kind of resource and to make sure that this new lockout rule is enforced?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the provisions around lockouts also include very robust new reporting requirements. And so now, we currently get information about when drivers start their sessions, when they start work. But to exactly your point about enforcing the lockout restrictions, we will have proposed expanding that reporting so that we'll know when drivers tried to start work, when they were forced off the app, if that were to happen. So we'll be able to track that and monitor that.
And is there a penalty involved in this if they don't adhere to the rule?
I believe there is a penalty, but I would have to go back to the proposal to confirm the numbers.
Commissioner Bader, and we can get you. Well, I think you already have a copy, but we can re-up that for you. Okay. Any other questions from the commission? Go ahead, Paul. Okay. Great. Russell, thank you so much for your presentation, for your work on this. This work is going to get our industry to a better place. And I appreciate your team and the entire policy data analytics team's work on this particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Now I will turn it over to Cheryl Aludo.
Mr. Golden, can you unmute your mic and begin?
I'm Jerry Golden. Oh, just want to make sure my video is coming through. Am I?
No, not yet.
Jerry, we can come back to you. Can we keep on moving and then help him get his camera? Thank you, Jerry. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Oh.
Okay. Well, here's ready, but
Yes, Jerry Golden his video is working and it's available.
Whatever you prefer.
yes, proceed, Mr. Golden.
Okay, great. I'm Jerry Golden, and since September, the Chief Policy Officer at Lyft. Lyft values the opportunity to address the TLC's proposed amendments to the rules governing high volume for hire services and minimum driver pay. Lyft supports driver pay minimums and is proud of our earnings commitment, guaranteeing drivers keep 70% of rider fares after external fees. However well-intentioned, the proposed rules reinforce a flawed approach to driver pay that pressures rideshare companies to use lockouts to maintain the utilization rate. I want to emphasize that restricting driver access is not something Lyft ever wants to do. It's bad for our customers, both the drivers and the riders who use Lyft's platform. And so it's bad for Lyft. We only do it due to pressure from the Commission's rules. New York City already has some of the highest rideshare fares in the nation, and those fares are now additionally burdened by price increases from the new congestion fee, plus the upcoming consumer price index increase of nearly 4%. Excessive cost increases perpetuate a vicious cycle of higher prices, leading to less demand, fewer rides available for drivers, a lower driver utilization rate, and pressure to use lockouts. This is not theoretical. Lyft rides were already down mid-teens year over year in New York City last quarter, despite Lyft rides increasing nationwide through that same period. If these rules are enacted on top of the March CPI increase, we estimate a 4 to 6% further decrease in rides. We would have to remove the equivalent of over 1,200 full-time drivers to maintain 2024 utilization rates.
30 seconds remaining.
It's not just drivers who suffer. 37% of Lyft rides in New York City start or end in lower income areas. These are the riders that fall off most when costs increase. The proposed rules also rely on a biased report by James Parrott that inflates expense reimbursement rates, thereby further contributing to higher fares. Among the many flaws we detail in our written submission, it relies on an unreasonably small sample size. It claims cars are worth $0 after 5 years, even though more than half of the vehicles on Lyft's platform that gave a ride last year are 5 years or older, and overrepresents both renters and full-time drivers. Other jurisdictions like Minnesota, Massachusetts, and the rest of New York State manage to regulate minimum driver pay without factoring in utilization. Lyft proposes that the TLC work with stakeholders to develop a rational and workable alternative that poses less harm to drivers and riders. It's in this spirit that Lyft submits our comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Josh Gold from Uber.
Good morning. Let's start with some good news from last year. According to TLC data, high-volume drivers made 4% more than the previous year, with full-time drivers taking home $76,000. Driver Ezra Ginsburg, using a 10-year-old Camry, earned about $94,000, $11,000 more than 2023. And through our new partnership with taxis, Uber referred over 3.5 million trips to yellow cabs, getting thousands of drivers back on the road. But it wasn't all good. Uber riders and drivers sent over $625 million to the government. This year, that tax burden, the highest in the country, will grow even larger. Now on to the proposed rule. I urge you to review our written comments outlining miscalculations in the rate formula. If not corrected, the courts will step in. While you now acknowledge gas prices do go down, this report wrongly assumes EV charging wait times are not improving. Raising rates 53 cents per trip because some drivers rent SUVs is arbitrary. If rates go up every time a handful of drivers make a personal choice, companies will be forced to limit that choice. Assuming drivers replace cars every 5 years is unrealistic. TLC's own data cited in the Green Rides rule shows vehicles last 7 years. If this commission is committed to revising the pay rule every 2 years, you must also explore ways to reduce costs, not just how to pass them on. Your study confirms the plate cap is costing New Yorkers. Per the study, renting a plate costs $9,000 per year, translating to 63 cents per trip. We need a solution that allows long-term renters to eventually own their vehicles without overwhelming the city with new cars.
30 seconds remaining.
Insurance costs continue to rise, and the commission has done nothing to address it. Instead, you banned fleet owners' creative cost-saving solutions. You should be leading the charge in Albany for tort reform to stop frivolous lawsuits driving up premiums. Finally, I must express disappointment in TLC's claim that lockouts are a loophole. After 2019, you called them a feature of the rule. In 2023, when we warned that your rule would create access restrictions because of a free rider problem, you dismissed it as a company choice. Now, abandoning the measurement period relied on by companies is clearly arbitrary and capricious.
Time has expired.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is James Parrott from the New School.
Good morning. James Parrott. I am Senior Advisor and Senior Fellow at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the rules changes affecting high-volume for-hire vehicle driver minimum pay. Along with Professor Michael Reich of the University of California, Berkeley, I was co-author of the 2018 and 2019 studies that were the basis for the New York City minimum pay standard. Professor Reich and I also prepared similar reports for the city of Seattle in 2020 and the state of Minnesota in 2024. Last year, the TLC commissioned me to prepare an analysis of how the composition of driver expenses had changed since the inception of the pay standard. My report is discussed in the TLC's January 3rd notice of proposed rules and is available on the TLC's website. The vehicle fleet has evolved considerably since the inception of the New York City pay standard in 2019. There are many more SUVs of various sizes, 52% of the total, and electric vehicles. And the TLC is phasing in a policy that will require all high volume for-hire vehicles to be either electric or wheelchair accessible by 2030. My report included an analysis of electricity costs and driver time involved in charging EVs and the cost of short-term vehicle rentals.
30 seconds
My report
remaining.
is based on an extensive survey of drivers regarding current expenses, current data on the vehicle fleet, research on the cost of charging electric vehicles, and additional investigation on the cost of renting a TLC registered vehicle. Those responding to the survey largely drive full-time for Uber or Lyft, have done so for years, and 80% reported that driving is their sole source of income. The high proportion of survey respondents who drive full-time lines up with TLC trip data, showing that 3/4 of all trips in 2023 were provided by those who drive 30 or more hours weekly. The driver survey was the primary source of information on driver expenses for vehicle costs or rent and insurance. As Russell's pointed out, the composite per mile factor that we arrived at was 87.1 cents. I'd like to take just a couple of seconds to talk about the study of driver expenses that Uber commissioned HR&A, a consulting firm, to prepare a report. That report derives an overall per mile expense amount that is 29% less than my estimate. The main reasons for this lower estimate are that they used lower weights for the shares of EVs and rented vehicles in deriving the composite per mile factor, while my analysis in the HRA report finds similar results for fuel and charging expenses and for insurance. The HRA report uses an extremely flawed method to estimate vehicle costs. They estimate vehicle costs at 11 cents per mile, far less than the national average of 33 cents per mile for depreciation included in the IRS's the 70-cent per mile allowance, a factor that the companies themselves are urging drivers to take into account when they prepare their taxes for next year. My estimated vehicle payment is 31.2 cents, much closer to the 33 cents per mile depreciation factor in the IRS. Thank you.
Dr. Parrott, I have a question. So I want to go back to your initial report in 2018. And I've read that report, and throughout that report, I just want to be clear that, you know, I don't think that report ever envisioned lockouts, but instead envisioned that Uber or Lyft or the high volume companies would not onboard more drivers than they need. And that has somehow changed into lockouts over time. And so can you talk a little bit about your 2018 report on, you know, Uber should control their onboarding versus lockouts?
When we did the initial study, we spent a lot of time trying to understand the business model that Uber and Lyft pursued in operating for-hire vehicles in New York City. And that led us to conclude that the companies have an incentive to flood the streets with as many drivers and cars as possible, disregarding what those drivers are able to earn. There obviously needs to be a balance between the supply of drivers and the demand for rides on the part of passengers. Uber and Lyft were not trying to regulate to keep the driver supply in line with consumer demand. Putting utilization in the denominator of the pay standard, as we did in New York City, was meant to provide an incentive for the companies to better regulate their own operations. There was no requirement that they lock out drivers, but it was clearly in their interest, if they followed the incentives indicated in the pay standard, to more carefully regulate the number of drivers. They haven't done that. The reason that Seattle and Minnesota did not include utilization in their pay standards was that they didn't think they had the data capacity to do that. New York City and the TLC, we're very fortunate to have a TLC research staff that is fully capable of analyzing that data and monitoring utilization and making periodic adjustments as needed.
One last question for you. You know, the high volume for hire vehicle industry has changed tremendously over the last 7 years since your last report and this one. Obviously, if you can talk about those changes, including EV mandate, including a rental market that was never anticipated before, and how that has changed and increased drivers' expenses.
Yeah, no, so In 2018, when we did the first study, the most common vehicle used was a Camry sedan. What we've seen over the past few years, along the, in keeping with the sort of the national consumer preference for larger vehicles, there's been a concerted shift away from sedans and smaller cars toward mid-size and full-size SUVs. The companies actually encourage that shift because they have premium services that charge passengers higher fares to be driven in a larger car. So the companies actually encourage drivers to get larger cars, even though they don't get paid for maintaining that larger car if they're dispatched a regular non-premium fare. There's also been a concerted shift toward greater use of EVs, and New York City is among the leaders around the country and around the world in mandating that for-hire vehicle services be 100% either EV or wheelchair accessible by 2030. So that percent of EVs has increased a lot in recent years. EVs are more expensive initially, the maintenance might be less, but there's also the challenge in charging an EV in New York City, where most drivers do not have a driveway and a garage where they can charge the vehicle at home. They have to go to public charging stations. The rapid growth in the size of the EV fleet has meant that drivers oftentimes have to wait. We recognize in the report, contrary to what the Uber representative indicated, that driver waiting times are coming down. We sort of build that into the estimate. And what we estimate for electric vehicle charging, the cost of that, the electricity cost, is very close to what Uber's own study estimated for electric vehicle charging. So there shouldn't be any issue about that. And we do adjust for changing gas prices. We factor in the price of gas as it's looking at the average over the past 6 months when it has been coming down. So that is less than if we used a 12 or an 18-month average.
Are there any other questions for Dr. James Parrott? Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Parrott.
Thank you.